Okay, so we're continuing our series on Zionism, and today we are going to look at the evolution of Zionism. And in order, we're sort of progressing through not the history of Zionism, but the philosophy of Zionism. We had started talking about the definition of Zionism, and we had a discussion about what could be a consensus view as a definition of Zionism. It was interesting at our offices this week at Nefesh B'Nefesh. So we had a discussion about Zionism, and somebody said that there's no real definition of Zionism. There are just people's agendas. People have an agenda, and therefore they take their agenda and they form that into the definition of Zionism. I think that our definition of Zionism, was pretty consensus building. The right of the Jewish people to self determination on their historic homeland, the land of Israel. I think that was, I don't think that's agenda driven, but they were convinced of their own opinion. And then we went from the definition of Zionism. We talked about when Zionism began. That was our second topic. And then we've slowly progressed. This is our fourth class that we've had. So that we're talking about here. And what we're trying to do is really just show what Zionism is really all about, without the politics, without the noise, without the screaming, without all different types of things. Just trying to understand Zionism. And here, what we're going to be doing in this lecture, which I think is a very important topic, is the evolution of Zionism, is recognizing the fact that Zionism started in one place and has slowly evolved throughout time. Now, I'd say a lot of times, people say evolution, they say, well, that's then it's not pure. So a movement shouldn't evolve. A movement should have its principles, and it shouldn't evolve past those principles. It should stay true to those principles. And I think that's true. I think that's a very good point. But I don't believe that Zionism has evolved outside of its principles. I don't think that is true. I think that Zionism has evolved mostly because of its success. I think that a lot of people. It's a shame. We're Jews, so I say this slightly in humor, but all humor has some truth to it. We're Jews, so we're galvanized to action based on suffering, based on pain, based on tragedy, based on something happening that we wouldn't like to happen. And we're not. I'm sorry for laughing, but we're not used to success. Because when we succeed, we have a lot of trouble handling success. We don't really like success. We're not used to. We like to complain. We like to say, "Oh, yeah." And success doesn't mean that we're not trying to get better. It doesn't mean success doesn't have to equal complacency, and it never should. But it is quite comical that a lot of times what we see as our relationship to Israel, especially for Zionists outside of Israel, is we have to be there to support the state of Israel, because the state of Israel needs our support, and without our support, who knows what's going to happen? So we have to donate to Israel, and we have to stand up for Israel against its detractors. We have to lobby for Israel with the American government or whatever government that you happen to be close to. And I'm not taking away from any of that, but every once in a while, Jews should allow themselves the privilege and the opportunity to sit back and say, you know what, we're doing pretty well. This past week, we saw that Israel was named Israelis are the ninth happiest people in the world, which means that Israel's the ninth happiest place to live in the world. It also came out this week that in 2022, Israel was the fourth strongest economy in the world. Fourth strongest economy in the world. Little old Israel. And as we know, Israel is one of the top 10 militaries in the world. So that's three categories we find ourselves in the top 10 of. That makes a lot of other countries that should be, very, I don't want to use the word jealous, but envious, maybe a little of our position and how well we're doing. And we should sit there as Jews and say, hey, this is a great place to be. We've succeeded. We had we didn't come to a ready-made Israel, right? This wasn't a place that had developed cities and everything was great. We built this place for 200 years before there was an Israel, a state of Israel. The land was desolate. It was inhabited by a few nomads. There were tiny Jewish communities spread out. Very few Arabs that were around. Excuse my cough. Very few people, and hardly any development in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, whatever you say. In 1967, when Israel came into that land, there were only 4 places that had running water. The rest of that region were using 2,000-year-old cisterns from Roman times. In the 1800s, the country didn't. There was no Tel Aviv. There was barely any cities. Whole tracts of land. And Mark Twain wrote that you could walk for days and not see anything, not see any person, not see any. And you go to Israel today, and I don't know how many people that are watching this live in Israel, or how many people regularly visit Israel, but I see every year the entire country changes. There is so much that is completely different about Israel every single time that we go there, and that we see the country. It's absolutely incredible. So the evolution of Zionism, which is what this lecture is all about, is about how Zionism, has to change to address going from one stage, which is, hey, we've got to come back to Israel, to, okay, what do we do now that we've done it, that we're successful? And again, I don't think we should be hesitant to say that we are successful. I think that's a good thing. Okay, I want to remind everybody that this is not a monologue. I don't have a prepared script in front of me. I'm not reading off of something, and that I don't want you to interrupt. Please, you can hear my voice is scratchy, and I would appreciate the break every once in a while. So please do not hesitate to throw in your own comments, questions, objections. This audience does not object enough. That's you always agree with what I'm saying, or at least you hold in your objections. I'd like to hear some feedback if possible. Okay, so let's get moving here and see what we're talking about. So let's talk about stage 1 of the evolution of Zionism. Okay, and so let's start talking about the late 1800s. This is where the political movement of Zionism begins, right? And this was anti-Semitism in Europe, dangerously high, right? We've 2,000 years. Our nation's history was wandering from place to place. Sometimes places would be welcoming to us. Sometimes they would not be welcoming to us, and they'd be exiled from their land, right, by the Romans. Truth is, I keep mentioning this. I have to do more research into this, but I'm seeing more and more evidence that while we were exiled from our land by the Romans, we weren't fully out of the land. Now, again, we always had a small Jewish community, but we couldn't say that Israel wasn't a population center for the Jewish people really until the 700s. Again, I want to do a lot more research into that. But from the Roman times, we started spreading out to the 4 corners of the world. Okay, and we know how Jewish history works, right? We find temporary refuge in one place, and then as time goes on, now why would this happen? Because countries were not doing well economically. They would see Jews as the middlemen that had contacts throughout the world. International trade was the key to success, to economic success for different nations. They didn't have the wherewithal to trade with other countries. So the Jew who had contacts throughout the world, if you brought the Jew into your country, that Jew could improve the economy. So you would take a suffering nation. The nation would bring in Jews, would welcome Jews in, announce that this is a place where you'll have rights and you'll have freedom and you won't be persecuted. The Jews would come in, improve the country's economy, and now they didn't need the Jews, so that's where anti-Semitism would start. So we would go through these cycles of going from place to place, right? For hundreds of years, Spain was an incredibly welcoming place until we were thrown out of Spain. England was a welcoming place until we were thrown out of England. Germany, welcoming place until we know what happens. So So we go from place to place, and we suffer through crusades, we suffer through pogroms, we suffer eventually through a Holocaust, and we know that this is the story of Jewish history. Now, we talked about last week the Jewish question, right? And now that was the real spur to Zionism. How for 200 years, leading up to World War II, the Jewish question was one of the top questions the world was asking. Okay, this would be the topic at coffee houses, at bars, over the Shabbat table. Jews and Gentiles asked the question in two very different ways, but asking the question of what should happen to the Jews. That was our lecture last week. And the answer never was, let's incorporate them into our country. That was never the answer. The answer was, where are we going to send them? Where should they go? Where the Jews don't have a land. They don't belong here, and they should go somewhere else. And the Jews began to realize that ultimately they're going to always be rejected. They're never going to find a home somewhere else. So that began the quest of the Jews of asking, where should we go? And the answer, as we know, is what Theodor Herzl came up with, which was, let's go home. We do have a home. We have a homeland. We're not, no, not everybody lives there today, but that's where we should go. We should establish a Jewish state where we could determine our own future, our own destinies. Let's go there and let's make that home. And that is what the Jews go ahead, and that's their aim. Okay? That's the stage one of Zionism, the decision to answer the Jewish question by saying it is time to establish a Jewish state. Any questions? Any comments? Any objections? Anybody want to just tell an interesting story? Something.
I have a little story.
Okay, Susan, let's hear.
It's a little out of order. I should do it a little later, but I'm ready to. You're asking. Okay. So if we can fast forward 1976, your friend Netanyahu is in at MIT. I'm sorry. Was he not your friend?
I would like to say that I'm friends with the Prime Minister of Israel, but I can't say that we are friends.
Okay. That you're wannabe friend. Okay.
I like to be friends with everybody. I have political friends on the left and on the right, and anywhere in between, all parties.
So my mother, staunch Zionist, they lived in Newton in the suburbs of Boston, Cambridge, whatever, and very active in Hadassah. She was American and Zionist Affairs chairperson, spoke, even interviewed on the radio, all that. So there's this, speakers list. So she goes to the list. Netanyahu was at MIT under the name of Ben Neteh. Now that's from Wikipedia, and I saw it on the internet, so it must be true. Anyway.
It is true. It is true, by the way. It is true.
Okay. So he had already got his undergrad. It was the point he was getting his graduate degree. So she calls him up and invites him to speak at the Israel government sent him to get the education. Part of the agreement was to be available, to the community. So she called him up and, asked him to speak. And, he's in school during the day. He said he could speak at night. So my mother arranges a meeting at our house, in the evening. And he took public transportation, from Cambridge to Newton. And so this is my mother we're talking about. She invites him for dinner, this young student. So that's kind of the story. He comes to the house, has dinner with the family, and then speaks at the meeting, and the rest is history.
Right. And that's probably why he became prime minister.
Well, actually, I'm sure. It interestingly, once more that I read, so that was 1976. Then I guess it was still the same year he was supposed to get his doctorate at MIT, but Yonatan, his brother, died. So at that point, he went back to Israel, and that is when he entered politics. So just probably weeks after meeting Mom for dinner, he entered politics.
Yeah, that could be. See, there you go. Okay, great story. Thank you for the interlude there. Okay, so let's go on here to stage 2 of the evolution. Okay, so now Zionism, the movement grows. Okay, and now it's more than just Theodor Herzl's speeches. and his book Der Judenstaat, right, the Jewish state, right? It becomes a popular movement, and not only that, but people start actually putting it into practice. They start moving to Israel and they start developing the land, right? They start making it that it's. And by the way, at this stage, the very early stage of Zionism, Arabs that live in what was then Palestine are very happy with the Jews coming in because they improve the infrastructure. There's investment. Things start moving up, and the country becomes more advanced, and it becomes easier to live in the country. The economy is improving, so that's a very good stage of the beginning of Zionism. And now the Jews start going around and Herzl had started this, but lobbying the international community to allow for a Jewish state in what was then again Palestine. Right, that was the idea. And they put emphasis on saving the Jews and having a place where Jews can go and be safe. That's the goal. Now, the British at this point, this is before World War I and before the British have the mandate over Palestine. The British are very supportive of the idea of creating a Jewish state. This is something that they think is a very good idea. And so therefore, they say, look, we can't offer you Palestine, but we can offer you land in Africa, right? That's what they called it Uganda. It was really Kenya, but they offered it. They called it Uganda and said you could have that, and that would be the safe a safe refuge for the Jewish people that they could go to, and becomes right as part of stage 2 of Zionism, because that decision is ultimately rejected. Right, it's ultimately rejected, and the delegates of the Congress vote. The Zionist Congress, where the vote took place. Now they studied it for a couple of years. This wasn't an all 1 foot type of rejection. For a couple of years, they looked at this plan and wanted to see if this would be a practical plan and a practical idea of something that they should do. And they really did look at this idea and took it seriously, because it would have saved world Jewry at the time. They didn't realize how high the stakes were, but they realized the stakes were high and this could be a place. But the Jews reject this idea, the Zionists reject this idea, and put, we would say in gambling terms, they put all their chips down on Israel, on the land of Israel. And this becomes stage 2 of Zionism, where we say it's self-determination in our historic homeland, not just self-determination. To us, this is obvious. Of course, the state of Israel has to be in the land of Israel. But this was not obvious back then. It wasn't obvious because Zionism, at its initial stages, at its seminal points, was about saving the Jews, about creating a place of refuge. So the idea that it had to be in Israel was not the priority. That was not something that was a given. So therefore, stage 2 of Zionism becomes, okay, where do we want to create this land? Where are we going to have this? That becomes stage 2 of deciding it must be in Israel. Okay. Let's move on to stage 3. Now, stage 3 is 1948. This is a time where Zionism could very well come to an end. How? Because in 1947, what the Zionists have been working towards their entire existence was having a Jewish state in the land of Israel. Now, then Eretz Yisrael, we don't like to talk about this because it's so impolitically correct, but it included what today is Jordan, right? So when the partition plan is offered to the Jews, it's not just that half the state was offered to them, but it's really less than a third of what they had been working towards. And that was one factor that caused hesitation for the Jewish people to accept the partition plan, because they weren't 100% convinced that they should give up on some of their land. The second problem was that they were asking for war. They were essentially going in and saying, if they knew that if they declared their independence, the Arabs would attack. This is 3 years after the Holocaust. They do not have a trained army. They do not have high caliber weapons. This is the Arabs outnumber them, and the Arabs outarm them. They're stronger, better trained, and more people. So having these threats as 1948 comes causes hesitation. One of the things that I love, one of the exercises I love to do to groups that I teach or students that I teach, is ask the question of, if you were Ben Gurion and go back to 1948, do you declare a state? And if you're being honest with yourself, and I ask the students and the groups that I speak to be honest with themselves, it's always half and half. Half the group does not exactly accept the fact that we should have declared independence. And this is in hindsight, and we lost 1% of our people in that war, even though we won it. But it's not a simple decision. So stage 3 of Zionism is accepting the fact we should have a state. Part of stage 3 is the initial years of that state. And we look back and we look at Israel today, as we started off this lecture, and talk about how great Israel is and how successful Israel is. But when we take a step back and we look back and we say, okay, what do the beginning years look like? They were harsh, very, very harsh. Once the the Jews from Arab lands came in, those refugees came into the land, you had a good, sizable part of the population, hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people living in tents. We're not talking about people without running water. That's a given. We're talking about people that do not have permanent housing as shelter in the desert. This is very hard. Cold winters, boiling hot summers, living in tents. And it did not get solved within a year or two. This was the first couple of years, we're talking about 5 to 10 years of a harsh beginning for the state of Israel. So we go from stage 1 is facing hundreds of years of persecution. That's how Zionism begins. Stage 2 is the struggle to get the world to give us a state. And stage 3 is creating that state. Now, at this point, we could say that's the end of Zionism. When we have groups that would come to our Aliyah campus in the middle of Jerusalem, I bring them up to the roof and ask them to look out at the view. You can see from our roof from all the way of North Jerusalem to all the way to South Jerusalem, with West Jerusalem sitting in front of us. And I asked them to find, this is a finished city. Jerusalem is completely built. I asked them to find in a completely built city what's out of place. And the answer is, always is the cranes. You always see tons and tons of cranes across the skyline of Jerusalem. And that message that I sent to them is that Zionism is never finished, that it didn't end in 1948 once we had a state. It continued to evolve. And this is where we are today in stage 4. 75 years later, we have gone from being a defensive state to an offensive state. Now, that does not mean that we're fighting offensive wars. We are not. We never have, and we never will. We are not looking to conquer the world or even conquer our neighbors. That's not what we're doing. But what we're talking about is that we're no longer just in defensive mode. We're not just talking about how do we ward off our enemies. We're asking ourselves, how can we develop? How can we evolve? How can we grow? How can we celebrate the success that we had? How can we bring some of those enemies into our camp? And we've been doing that amazingly. You look at the Abraham Accords, and now people that swore our destruction are developing plans with us. We are advancing the world into a better place together. That's not all our enemies. Not everybody has come around yet, but we're on the way. And that's this idea of we've gone from facing, and this is probably the most important part, we have gone from facing existential threats to now no longer facing existential threats. It was consistently, we all remember the days where Israel was threatened existentially. Our enemies could take us out. And now our enemies recognize the fact that if they all got together and they all decided to attack Israel, we would still win, and win very, very quickly. And Zionism now, we recognize, is what I would call, the movement is now the metaphysical fuel to the physical state of Israel. It is what we believe in. It is our ideals. It is our values. And that Zionism has now evolved to becoming this fuel, this fuel that we all sit with pride and celebrate. And that is what has become the fulfillment of the Jewish state as a fulfillment of the Zionist dreams. That is the 4th stage of the evolution of Zionism. And it's an amazing place to be. Absolutely, absolutely amazing place to be, which, by the way, I don't know how many people Rewind 75 years, rewind 60 years when Israel turned 15, rewind 50 years at Israel's 25th birthday. If you would say, look, one day we won't have full peace, we won't have full prosperity, not all problems will be solved. But let me tell you, here's the amazing thing. We're going to get to a point where we are no longer going to worry about our existence anymore. We are now going to worry about moving on from there. So what's the next stage? The fifth and last stage, moving forward. Before we know it, and it's a little less than 2 months away, we celebrate 75 years of Israel. Before we know it, we're going to be at the 100th year. God willing, we should all be healthy and celebrating together in Israel at its 100th birthday. So where do we go? What does this fifth stage look like? What does Israel look like in 25 years? I can only imagine. I know of at least 3 well-known authors who are writing books of Israel at 100. What Israel has to look like in 2048. And that's the question that we now, as Zionists, not worried about our existence, not worried about our enemies. Now the question becomes, what do we go ahead and plan for the next 25 years? And what we need to become, what Israel needs to develop into, is this global influencers that addresses international problems, whether they be climate change, water shortages, more efficient transportation. We need to become from the startup nation to the influential nation. And that's where we need to go. We're seeing it happen. We're seeing it happen with water technology and so many different things. We're watching it. And what we need to be careful of are the internal divisions that could ruin everything, right? If we look back, Abraham Lincoln always talked about how America would never be destroyed by an external enemy. It would be by internal strife. And that's really what Israel has to be careful of. All great countries have gone through internal strife. Excellent countries are able to get past them. Weak countries never survive them. We do not want to become America in its 85th year, suffering a civil war that takes out mass amounts of its populace. What we need to do is figure out, first and foremost, before we look externally what we can do, we need to look internally and ask ourselves, how can we make sure that this country's fractures do not become large breaks that destroy the country? So we need to be able to take our own country, unite ourselves in a much better way, figure out ways of civil discourse that are much better, and then move on through to ensure that Zionism's next evolution is one of even greater success. So that's what I'd say. Those are the 5 stages of Zionism. Again, just to review what we've talked about today. The first stage of Zionism are the 200 years leading up to the formation of the state, where we face rising anti-Semitic rates. We answer the Jewish question by saying we need to build our own state, where we can determine our own future, our own safety, to the point where we start convincing the world of that and start moving in mass numbers to Israel. Then we go on from there and move on to the next stage, which is the beginning of the state. Then we get on to stage 4, which is today, where we're at now at 75 years. And now stage 5 is over the next 25 years. Looking forward, what are we going to accomplish? What contributions can we make to the international community? And most importantly, how can we make sure that we ourselves are not getting to a place where we would have problems and not be able to survive going forward? Okay, that's today's lecture. I hope everybody enjoyed, and I hope to see everybody next week. Shalom.
Shalom. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.